you're tired of using the same old drum patterns in all of your beats, in today's video we're going to explore some unique drum patterns that you can use. In a video I put out a little while ago where I pointed out the 5 red flags of a bad beat, one of the red flags that I talked about was an improper use of drum patterns. I recommended getting to know and understanding basic drum patterns before you try to get wild and do something a little bit different like we're about to do in this video. With that said, I'm going to cover some unique drum pattern ideas that you can use once you get more comfortable with the more basic patterns. By the way guys, if you enjoy my videos, think about subscribing. It really does help my channel out, and if you ever get bored of my videos, it's just one click away to unsubscribe. Starting with the first one, I call this the half and half. The way this unique drum pattern works is that you're going to have the first half of your 1-bar drum pattern be very straightforward, very basic and typical, and the second half is going to be a bit unusual and unique. To do this, we're going to be using very common drum sounds. We have a kick, a snare, as well as a hi-hat. You can substitute a shaker instead of a hi-hat if you'd like. So we're going to start off by making a very typical hi-hat pattern with an up and down velocity here. As many of you guys know, if you've seen my videos before, I always recommend a good starting place be putting a kick on the 1 and a snare on the 2 and the 4. At this point, I'm going to fill out the kick pattern a little bit more, maybe add an extra snare here. Alright, now for the actual unusual part. As you guys can see, this 1-bar loop is very straightforward. Now what I'm going to do is go into the second half of my drum pattern and start making some changes. Here with the hi-hats, I'm going to change the velocity of these notes here, just so they're different than the pattern in the first half. With the snare pattern, again, I'm going to leave the first half alone. But in the second half of the snare pattern, I'm going to start to get unusual and make a different placement for my snares. So I'll shift these over 1, let's say. As you guys may have noticed, this is a very unusual placement for snares when it comes to making a hip hop beat. And with the kick pattern, I'll also move these around as well. So we get this cool new drum pattern that really has a unique feel to it. And even though I placed my snares and my kicks in these particular locations, I can do something completely different if I wanted. For example, I'll shift this snare around here, and I'll move the kicks around again. And here I have yet another unique drum pattern. So if you guys want to hear how this would sound in an actual beat. So the reason why this technique works and the reason why I recommend playing with the second half of the drum pattern instead of the first is because the first half of the drum pattern being so straightforward and typical helps us establish a very normal, typical rhythm for the listener. Therefore, it won't be quite as jarring once we get to the second half of the drum pattern where things start to get a little bit unusual. Whereas if I started with the unusual part being in the first half, this can be difficult for the listener to get a sense of what's happening rhythmically if it's the first thing that they hear. So if you plan on using this type of drum pattern in your beats, keep that in mind. First half is normal, second half is unusual. A great example of this drum pattern being used in an actual song is Breathe and Stop by Q-Tip. The second unique drum pattern is what I like to think of as the two-fold pattern. The components that we will be using for this pattern is just a kick and a snare. As I mentioned in the last pattern with a 1-bar loop, we typically place a kick on the 1 and then a snare on the 2 and the 4. And this leaves us with room to get creative in between with additional drums. For example, if I put a kick right here. Very basic drum pattern here. In this unique drum pattern though, we are basically taking everything that happens within 1 bar and making it all happen in half a bar essentially. So we basically have double the amount of activity happening with our kick and our snare compared to a usual typical drum pattern. This can make for a really driving, aggressive energy in your drum loop. If you guys want to hear how this would sound in an actual beat. As you guys can hear, this drum pattern's already sounding really dense, so adding in more drum sounds might not even be necessary. Here I just added in one more kick compared to what I showed you guys before, but outside of that, it's hard to imagine having more space to add more drums into this pattern. And this is why you might want to lean away from using a hi-hat in this pattern as well. We just have a lot more snares and kicks in this pattern compared to a more straightforward pattern. On top of that, this pattern is highly repetitive, so the need for consistency, which we would typically get out of a hi-hat pattern, isn't as needed, since this pattern that we already have here is very consistent. This is a drum pattern that I like to use whenever I make a beat where I have a sound that varies across a long period of time. And I need something that's short and consistent, almost as a counterbalance. A great example of this pattern being used in an actual beat is a song called Overdose by Black Milk. If you listen to that song, you'll notice how the bass pattern is very long. It's something like an 8-bar loop. So using a very short, consistent drum pattern like this can be a great way to counterbalance a very long, inconsistent loop used elsewhere. The next pattern that we're going to look at is something that I like to call the clap hat. With this pattern, we're just using a clap, a snare, and a kick. Essentially, we're foregoing using a hi-hat and using a clap instead as a means of replacement with this drum pattern. So to do this, I'm going to place a clap on the 1, 2, 3, and the 4. And I want to point out, you don't have to use a clap, you can use any percussive sound really. And from here, you'd make your kick and your snare pattern as usual and just fill it out any way that you want. Obviously, you don't want to get too wacky though. And if you guys want to hear how this would sound in an actual beat, just like what I mentioned in the prior example, the reason why this works is because typically a hi-hat would be used to create a very consistent sense of rhythm in your beat. Here, by placing the clap on every beat, we are essentially doing just that, creating a very consistent sense of rhythm. We're just doing it in a different way here. As well, since claps are more dense textures compared to a hi-hat, we don't necessarily need as many of them in order to fill up this beat compared to if we were using a hi-hat. Personally, this is a drum pattern that I like to use if I want to make a switch up. It can really provide an anthemic feel in your beat. Example of this being used in an actual beat is Heavy Metal and Reflective by Azealia Banks. Although that was made in double time, the concept is still the same. And finally, the last unique drum pattern that we're going to look at is the 3-3-2 pattern. This can be used to create a different type of fundamental rhythm in your beat. An example of this being used is pretty much every single drill beat, but we can also put a unique spin on this if we were to use it in a different way. So the way that this is used in drill, for example, is on the hi-hat. This follows a 3-3-2 pattern, so we put our hi-hat down, count 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, and then this repeats over and over again. And you guys can hear this just makes for a different underlying rhythm in the beat compared to the typical 1, 2, 3, 4 rhythm that we're all used to hearing in most hip hop beats. But this type of rhythm doesn't just have to be relegated to being used on the hi-hat patterns like for a drill pattern. For example, what if we were very typical and straightforward with our hi-hats and we use this 3-3-2 framework for the kick and the snare instead? So I'll place the kick down first, then count 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, and instead of placing a kick down here, I'll put down a snare, and I'll just repeat this pattern. If you guys want to hear how this would sound in an actual beat, and with the second pattern that I made that I just showed you guys, you guys can hear this can just be a great way to introduce a different type of underlying rhythm into your beat. So those are some different types of drum patterns that you can think about introducing into your beat. I will say again though, if you are just starting out, you might not want to get too audacious here. I recommend watching the video that I mentioned at the very beginning of this video, 5 red flags of a bad beat. In that video, you can see how this can go wrong if you do it improperly. Also, I do want to mention I plan on putting out a full beat making course in a couple of months. If you're interested, do join that wait list. I'm going to give people access to discounts as well as early access to the course and a bunch of free stuff, so you don't want to miss out on that. If you guys have enjoyed this video, like and subscribe. My free drum kit's available in the description box below, as well as a link to the Discord if you're interested in having your beats reviewed live. I do that every so often, and I will see you guys next time.